It was the summer of 1983 when I first walked through the doors of the office building where I would begin my journey. I had just turned 22, fresh out of community college with nothing more than a handful of dreams, a few dollars in my pocket, and a deep desire to make something of myself. My family wasn't wealthy. In fact, we had always struggled. My father worked long hours as a mechanic, my mother managed to get by as a secretary in a small law firm. But neither of them had the kind of career that allowed us to live comfortably. My own aspirations had always been bigger than what I saw around me, bigger than the small town of Cleveland, Ohio, where I grew up. At the time, the economy wasn't in great shape. Jobs were hard to come by. The steel industry, once the lifeblood of the city, was in decline, and many families were struggling. It wasn't that I didn't have the will to work, it was that opportunities seemed scarce. I had applied for numerous jobs after finishing my courses, everything from retail to office work, even positions in factories, but nothing stuck. It felt like every door I knocked on slammed shut. Finally, in late July of 1983, I landed something. Not the job I had hoped for, but it was a start, a janitor position at a large office building in downtown Cleveland. The pay wasn't much. I made $4 an hour, which barely covered my rent and transportation costs. But I took it, knowing that it was the only option available to me at the time. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't what I had dreamed of, but it was work. And for the first time in months, I felt a sense of relief. I arrived on my first day at 6 p.m., ready to begin my shift. The building was filled with office floors that hummed with activity throughout the day but were almost deserted by the time I came in to clean. The building had a mix of offices, a few tech firms, and small businesses. The floors were mostly marble and tile, gleaming under the fluorescent lights. As I walked around, pushing my cart and listening to the echo of my footsteps, I couldn't help but feel like an outsider. I knew I didn't belong there in the traditional sense, I was just a janitor. But as I began my work, cleaning the empty offices, I started to notice things. I would see the managers and executives leave the building in their suits, carrying briefcases. I would watch them walk to their expensive cars and drive off into the night. There was something about that world that called to me. I didn't know how I would get there, but I knew I wanted more than just cleaning the floors. For the first few months, I simply did my job, cleaning the same floors, wiping down the same desks, scrubbing the same toilets. I kept my head down, did what was asked of me, and tried to stay out of everyone's way. But something inside me told me to watch and learn. I knew that the people who worked in the upper levels of the building, the executives and the managers, had something that I didn't. They had knowledge, experience, and connections. I didn't have any of that yet, but I was determined to change that. One day, about 4 months into my job, I met a man who would eventually change my life. His name was Tom, and he was the building manager. Tom was in his late 40s, sharp, and always impeccably dressed. He had worked in real estate for years and had an air of success about him. He seemed to know everyone in the building. He had a sense of authority, not because he was a boss, but because people respected him. Tom would often come into the building late in the afternoon, usually before I started my shift, and we would exchange pleasantries. I always admired his calm demeanor and the way he carried himself. One evening, he asked me how I was doing. I told him the truth, that I was getting by, but I wanted more. He smiled, leaned against the wall, and said, "You know, it's not about how hard you work. It's about how smart you work. And you've got to have patience." I had never really thought about it that way before. Patience? I asked, a little confused. "What do you mean?" Tom chuckled. "Patience isn't just waiting. It's about understanding that success doesn't come overnight. If you want to be more than a janitor, you've got to start somewhere and keep learning. People don't get to the top by accident. They get there by knowing the right things, having the right connections, and having the patience to climb the ladder, step by step." His words stayed with me. I didn't understand everything he meant at the time, but I knew one thing for sure: Tom had something that I wanted. Over the next few months, I started paying closer attention to everything. I would arrive early and leave late, sweeping the floors around the offices where the executives worked. I noticed how they interacted with each other, how they spoke to clients, how they carried themselves with confidence. Tom had been right. It wasn't just about hard work. It was about knowing where you were going and taking the steps necessary to get there. By the end of the year, I decided to take the first step toward making something of myself. I enrolled in a night course in business management at a local community college. It was a stretch. I was already working long hours at the building and studying in the evenings. But I was determined. I had no other choice. If I wanted to leave the janitor's closet behind, I had to keep moving forward. In 1984, I started to gain a little recognition. The building management had taken notice of how hard I worked, and one evening, Tom pulled me aside. "We've got a vacancy in maintenance," he said. "It's not much, but it's a step up. Want to take it?" I couldn't believe it. This was the break I had been waiting for. It wasn't a glamorous position, but it was a step toward something better. I accepted immediately. Over the next 2 years, I moved from being a maintenance worker to a supervisor. I was learning the ropes of building management, dealing with vendors, negotiating contracts, and working my way through the system. I was still cleaning the floors at night, but during the day, I was learning the business, one task at a time. By 1986, after 3 years of hard work, I had become the assistant manager of the entire building. I had earned the trust of the owners, worked my way into the circle of decision-makers, and began making my mark on the company. But I still wasn't satisfied. I knew there was more to learn, and I wasn't done yet. In 1988, I made a decision that would change everything. I had saved up enough money and gained enough experience to start my own property management business. It wasn't a big leap, but it was a huge risk. I rented a small office, bought a few tools and equipment, and began looking for clients. My connections from my years at the office building were helpful. Slowly, I built up a client base. I was working long hours, sometimes 7 days a week, but I kept pushing forward. My business grew, slowly but surely. By 1993, my company was thriving. I had expanded into managing multiple buildings and had several employees working for me. I no longer cleaned floors. I was no longer the janitor, the maintenance worker, or the assistant manager. I was the owner of my own business. It had taken 10 years of steady work, patience, and a willingness to start at the bottom and climb slowly, step by step. And looking back, I could trace every part of my success to those early days, when I had walked into that office building as a janitor. It wasn't just about the work I did, it was about the lessons I learned. It was about understanding that success doesn't happen overnight, that you have to pay your dues and learn the ropes. And it was about patience, patience to wait for the right moment, patience to keep moving forward even when the path seemed unclear, and patience to trust the process. Today, I look back on the last decade with pride. I am the owner of a successful property management company with over 50 employees and clients across the country. The journey wasn't easy, but every challenge along the way taught me something valuable. I didn't take shortcuts. I didn't try to rush the process. Instead, I focused on the long game, and it paid off. Sometimes, when I think about my journey, I realize that if I had told someone back in 1983, when I was scrubbing floors and emptying trash bins, that I would one day own a business, they would have laughed at me. But that's the power of patience. You don't know how far you can go until you start, and you can't predict the journey. But if you keep working hard and staying focused, the possibilities are endless.